Okay, so I'm Peter Michelson. I'm chairing the colloquium committee for the physics department and applied physics this quarter. And today we have, I think, a very timely colloquium on scientific collaboration amidst shifting U.S.-China relations. And the format today is we'll start with our speaker, who I'll introduce shortly, Yangyang Cheng, who is here at Stanford visiting us. We'll have Yangyang will give a talk, a short talk, about 25-30 minutes, followed by a panel discussion. And Norbert Holtkamp, who is here. Norbert. I'll introduce Norbert and Yangyang now. Yangyang is a research scholar in law and a fellow at the Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center, where her work focuses on the development of science and technology in China and U.S.-China relations. Her essays on these topics have appeared in a number of journals, including the New York Times, The Guardian, The Nation, The Atlantic, MIT Technology Review, and the list goes on. Yangyang was born and raised in China and received her PhD in physics from the University of Chicago, I think in 2015, in particle physics, and her bachelor's degree before that from the University of Science and Technology of China's School for the Gifted Young. And I think that was in 2009. And before joining Yale, she worked on the Large Hadron Collider, both at the University of Chicago and as a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell University, and I think also at Fermilab. And today, as I say, she's now at the Yale Law School, devoting her work to policy and outreach, and you'll hear more about that. And Norbert Holtkamp, who will lead the panel discussion after the talk. Norbert is Shorenstein Airpark Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International... Tom. Wait a minute. I got mixed up. Tom is leading the panel discussion.
I'm Norbert.
Norbert is on the panel. Okay, so Tom Fingar is a Shorenstein Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, and he received his PhD in political science from Stanford University a few years ago, and served, after that, he worked as a research associate at the Stanford Arms Control Program, which was the predecessor of the Center for International Security and Cooperation at FSI. And Tom subsequently joined the U.S. Department of State, I think in 1986, and then moved to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence in 2005. And he also served concurrently as the chair of the National Intelligence Council until 2008, at least according to Wikipedia. Okay. And in 2009, Tom returned to Stanford and the Freeman Spogli Institute. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Yangyang.
Thank you so much, Peter, for the kind introduction. And it's really a special occasion for me to be here. And when I accepted Peter's overly kind invitation this spring and chose this week, I had no idea it would be such an eventful week. And so I was joking that since I didn't grow up in Beijing, this is the physically closest to Xi Jinping I would ever get. And so one way or another, history is being made. And I've been told that this clicker can only move forward. So it's like the second law of thermodynamics being on play here. So I have to deal with entropy. It doesn't even work, okay. But it's actually really, this is actually the first time I'm at Stanford Physics. And it's really special to me. As Peter mentioned, I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Science and Technology of China, but I did my undergraduate thesis on BEPC. And then some of you here already know that actually Pierre Pinansky was a senior or lead advisor, non-Chinese advisor on BEPC. And here there's a photo, undated but likely from the 70s, when he's seen here with the gentleman in glasses is Xie Jialing, who received his PhD at Stanford in 1951. And speaking of history, so earlier this summer when a journalist from South China Morning Post was interviewing me about the imminent expiration or potential or renewal of the U.S.-China agreement on science technology cooperation. And then there was a question to me was, Yangyang, what gives you hope? And I said, what gives me hope is history. Because history tells us how we got to where we are today. And it also shows that the path is not predetermined, it's contingent. It's filled with possibilities. So in order to understand our current state of US-China relations and the challenges facing scientific collaboration between the two countries, I'll take us through a brief walk through history. And as South China Morning Post journalist said, he did not expect my answer would take us back to the Qing Empire. But this is exactly where we will begin our story, because the history of US-China educational and scientific exchange is as old as US-China relations. In the mid-19th century, when the United States was still a relatively young republic and a developing power, partly to distinguish itself from establishment European empires and their aggressive approach towards Qing at the time, friendlier relations with the Qing Empire. One of the landmark treaties was the 1868 Burlingame Treaty that partly acknowledges Qing sovereignty and establishes most favored nations trade status, extends that to Qing China, and also provides conditions for Chinese laborers and students to come to the U.S. And following that, for the next decade, from 1872 to 1881, 100 in the U.S. on a Chinese educational mission, which was the first government-funded by Yun Wen, who was a Yale alum and was the first Chinese-born person to receive an undergraduate degree at the U.S. University. The Chinese educational mission met a lot of political pressure from both the U.S. and the Qing government at the time, including some of the boys, when they went back to China, were interrogated by police and questioned about their loyalty to the Qing throne. And it also faced racist backlash here in the U.S., and it was shut down in 1881 on the eve of the Chinese Exclusion Act. On the other hand, among the 120 boys, the ones who completed different extents of their studies rose to prominent positions in science and education and government in China, including this young man in the photo here, Liang Cheng, who played baseball at Phillips Andover in Chicago in 1903. Liang Cheng later became a prominent advocate for the Boxer indemnity scholarships in the early 20th century. And this was a time when continued educational exchange with China on the grounds that educating China's youth would be an effective way to influence the future. One of the examples is then president of the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign at the time, Edmund James, who was a lawyer, and he wrote a letter to President Teddy Roosevelt in 1905, quote here, that China is upon the verge of a revolution. The nation which succeeds in educating the young Chinese of the present generation will be the nation which will recap, quote, the largest possible returns in moral, intellectual, and commercial influence. And over the next few decades, through the first half of the 20th century, a small but steady stream of Chinese students came to the US to study. And the majority of them, similarly as the Chinese educational mission earlier, focused on science and engineering disciplines, which were seen as the most useful for building the nation and modernizing China at the time. And before World War II broke out that interrupted international travels, the majority of these Chinese students went back to China and helped lay the foundation of science, modern science and education in China. And in the 1940s, especially starting from the end of World War II, the nationalist government in China also started sending more Chinese students to the US to study when the two governments were allies in World War II, as a way to build up its science and education sectors. However, when Edwin James was writing a letter to President Theodore Roosevelt in 1905, China was indeed on the verge of the revolution, but it would not be the last. Before the second half of the 20th century, the communist takeover in 1949 was seen in the eyes of the American intelligentsia as the loss of China. And scientific exchange with the newly founded People's Republic was no longer encouraged as a way to cultivate a potential ally. According to the US policy establishment, that method had failed and failed catastrophically. And it was instead effectively cut off for fear of aiding an adversary. Earlier, we met Dr. Xie Jialing, who received his PhD in physics at Stanford in 1951. And afterwards, when he and a number of Chinese students were boarding a ship back to China, they were actually detained in Honolulu. And Xie later came to Chicago and pioneered accelerator physics in nuclear medicine at the time, before he was finally allowed to go back to China. Another example here is Professor Zhao Zhongyao, who did his PhD in the early 20th century. He was actually a lab mate of Carl Anderson's and made an instrumental discovery towards the discovery of the positron. And later, he actually went back to China to teach, and in 1945 was invited as a guest of the US government, representing the nationalist government of China, to witness the atomic testings at the Bikini Atoll. And then later he stayed in the US to acquire some equipment for particle and nuclear physics research in China while the communist takeover took place. And when he was on his way back to China, he was also detained in Japan. And the Caltech president Lee Dubridge at the time received these letters of plea from the Chinese government, from the Chinese students. And then the repatriation of Chinese students became a major issue during the ambassadorial talks between the US government and the People's Republic of China in the mid-1950s in Geneva. And this was later represented in a cartoon in China, where you could see the eagles is representing the US, and the China is technically represented by the rabbits to be seen as friendly, though they do not look very friendly here. And so for the next few decades, these hardened geopolitical borders represented by bodies of water were separated families, friends, and colleagues until the early 1970s. And so this is a context where, this is in the context of the Cold War, where there were tensions, of course, between the United States and the Soviet Union, but also tensions between China and the Soviet Union. So partly for both Beijing and Washington trying to maneuver this Cold War geopolitical dynamics, both governments sought friendlier relations with each other, including through the channel of scientific exchange. On the other hand, international scientific collaborations and exchange also carried a different context in the United States at the time, that partly to distinguish itself from the top-down, unfree Soviet science, the US government pushed this notion of a universal apolitical science to contrast itself like freedom science and unfree communist science. And so this is represented in a keynote address given by then Secretary of State William Rogers in February of 1971, when he gave an address called US Foreign Policy and Technological Age. So at that time, scientific exchange with other countries had lost that early 20th century or 19th century missionary zeal aimed at ideological transformation. Instead, Rogers said that international collaborations in science should be insulated from, quote, the vagaries of international politics. And the United States in particular, as, quote, the principal creator and principal user of new technology, should assume this mantle of global leadership and conduct scientific exchange. And this was also noted during Nixon's 1972 visit to China in the Shanghai Communique, where science and technology were noted as the first two items before sports journalism and culture as the two governments identified areas of mutually beneficial exchange. And starting with the particle physicist Chen Yangyang in 1971, Chinese-American scientists and also American scientists in general started visiting China, and there were scientific delegations from China that came to visit the US, including the nuclear physicist Zhang Wenyu, who came to visit SLAC. This photo is from November of 1971. And the Chinese-American scientists who pioneered educational exchange in the 1970s also broadened their activism in terms of lobbying the US government to normalize relations between Washington and Beijing. And in 1979, when the normalization finally happened, the first agreement signed between the United States government and People's Republic of China, signed by President Carter and Deng Xiaoping, was this agreement that I mentioned at the very beginning that expired and is on this temporary extension at the moment, the US-China Agreement on Science Technology Cooperation. And also, for the first time in decades, students from the People's Republic of China could go to the United States to study, including one of the pioneering programs in the 1980s when some of the standard testing systems like GRE were not available in China, was CASPIA, China-US Physics Education Examination and Admission System. And actually earlier on the image, we saw a registration card. A student was trying to return to China, and her name was Li Pei. Her husband, Guo Yonghuai, received his PhD from Caltech and was later an engineering professor at Cornell, and went back to China and was one of the leaders in the Chinese nuclear weapons program and died tragically in an air accident in the late 1960s. And his wife, Li Pei, was actually examination section for the physics admissions program in the 1980s. And in my discipline, this was at the time when China was trying to pursue its own particle accelerator, a higher energy particle accelerator, starting from a proton collider and later converting that to an electron-positron collider, largely thanks to Panofsky's suggestion. And in the summer of 1978, a Chinese accelerator physicist delegation came to visit Fermilab. And this was, the delegation was led by Dr. Xie Jialing, the Stanford alum, and they raised the Chinese national flag at Fermilab for the first time with then Fermilab director Bob Wilson. So this is the summer of 1978. 11 years later, the Chinese flag outside Wilson Hall at Fermilab was temporarily taken down. And this was after the crackdown at Tiananmen. Chinese researchers at Fermilab petitioned the lab to fly the Chinese flag at half-mast to commemorate the victims at Tiananmen. Fermilab's then director, Leon Lederman, ordered the flag removed instead. And how to engage with the government that had just so brutally cracked down on peaceful protesters caused deep schisms within the US academia. Many US academic associations and institutions halted collaborations with China. Some scientists, led by the Soviet dissident physicist Yuri Orlov, argued for a continued boycott, which was also advocated by some Chinese-American scientists, including the Harvard biologist James C. Wang Zhuo. On the other hand, there were also Chinese-American scientists, including Chen Yangyang and T.D. Liu, who pioneered the educational exchange in the 1970s, who argued that continued exchange would be mutually beneficial. And in this political context, the umbrella science and technology cooperation agreement was allowed to lapse until it was renewed in 1991, but this time with the added provisions of intellectual property protection. So there is a new dimension that is added to this political, geopolitical, technological discussion, which is commercial interests, as China integrates itself into global capitalism and was moving away from socialist central planning. Lobbying from US firms and China's integration into global capitalism was actually the main driving factor that eased tensions after Tiananmen, which eventually led to this golden era of US-China relations that we are seeing coming to an end at the moment. And so we need to understand that the underlying material context here, that as China moves from the periphery to the core of global capitalism and contests US hegemony, this shifting economic order is underlying the current tensions. So there is a drawing here. So in the summer of 1989, during the crackdown, Chen Daoli was actually in China at the time at an international physics conference. And he had commissioned this drawing from a Chinese artist that is technically to represent the heavy ion collisions. But afterwards, T.D. Li, in writing in the preface to the conference proceedings, He dedicated the proceedings to the victims of Tiananmen, and also noted here maybe the bulls were a metaphor for the students and the government that were in lock. And I feel here now there is additional context here that we may see this as a metaphor for US-China relations in this intra-capitalist rivalry. So in this context, we come to the present day, and I put this in quotation marks, the China threat. And to prepare for this talk, I actually Googled China threat and clicked on the images. And I do not recommend doing so. It's not a pleasant experience. However, there is an interesting information there, and there are, I would put it broadly in these three categories of concerns that the US government raises. The first is physical and digital security. This is what would be traditionally interpreted as, or the general public when we think about national security, when we usually think about like defending the physical security, and now in digital space, the security of data, privacy, surveillance, etc. That is in this realm. However, and that is of course valid and important. But what is important to note here is that the very term national security is a relatively new concept in the sense that it is developed after World War II. Remind the Department of Defense wasn't called the Department of Defense that long ago. It wasn't a concept in the American lexicon. And after World War II, and especially through the 1970s and 80s during economic competition with Japan, the concept of national security was enlarged to include economic security. So the idea is not just about things that can be used as weapons or directly for harm or surveillance as offensive instruments that needs to be tightly guarded. But the general idea is the opponent needs to be kept economically weaker, economically poorer, so they are militarily weaker. So this is the second category in terms of the US side is raising concerns that is not so much about the traditional sense of defense or security, but really about economic advantage or economic competition. And then there is a third category, which to me it should be the most important, but is often sidestepped, is with regards to democracy and human rights. Right? Science and technology are not neutral, and they can be used in a variety of ways, including for harm. So scientific collaboration, like science itself, is not a uniform good. It needs to be understood in context and understood in terms of how it is developed and how it is used and who benefits and who bears the cost. But what has happened is that often in the policy discourse in this country, human rights abuses from the Chinese government is being used as a smokescreen to argue for what is indeed economic competition or traditional forms of national security. And often when the valid concerns with regards to human rights abuses, such as surveillance technology, is being raised, the response is to erect a border along national lines, right? To not sell certain types of equipment to Chinese firms that would be used for surveillance or for weaponry. Well, that is fair, but that is effectively only restricting the harmful use by the user, but not the use itself. And that is not a consistent logic. It is a techno-nationalistic logic that breaks down at the border. And so conflating these different issues and blaming only China or authoritarianism as the root cause really obscures the more fundamental questions. And of course, the Chinese state is quick to exploit this double standard or the hypocrisy in some of the discourse here. And so in this context, where does university fit in? Well, when we talk about restraints or controls over transnational knowledge flows, there are two questions that may be raised. The first is it classified? And classified research, according to the National Security Directive that came out during the Reagan administration, effectively says like academic research should be allowed to be freely exchanged as much as to the greatest extent possible. And the way to mitigate that is through classification. And for classified research itself, it's rather limited on US campuses. And part of that is as a result of the students' anti-war protests in the 1960s, though it has seen a resurgence after 9/11. But I would argue here that focusing only on classified research itself in the current political debate kind of misses the point because it is rather narrow and specific. However, there are a lot of technologies and a lot of work that do not fall into or do not even come close to classified category that are still being restricted. And this comes to the second question is it priority? And so what has happened over the past 4 decades, as I mentioned earlier, with China's integration into global capitalism, is the overall that the world has been changed by neoliberalism and by globalization. That the privatization of higher education, the commercialization of academic research has had a profound impact of how science is done, what kind of topics are being pursued, and the freedom of academic inquiry in general. And after World War II, for a few decades, after World War II, when the US government became the primary funder for fundamental research at universities, for a few decades after that, most of the results from publicly funded research stayed in the public domain. This changed in 1980 with the passage of the Bayh-Dou Act that allows and actually indeed encourages universities to patent results from federally funded research and license them for profit. And today, some of the largest universities, including the University of California system and University of Texas system, these are public university systems, rival the largest private corporations in terms of the number of patents. And when the universities behave more like companies, and the richest universities behave like multinational corporations. And here, this extends more than just proprietary or commercialized research, but overall in terms of how universities managed and run, including how student recruitment is done. When I mentioned earlier, Edmund James in 1905, as the president of UIUC, was writing to President Theodore Roosevelt about admitting Chinese students. Right now, the UIUC is still one of the campuses with the largest Chinese student population. And several years ago, the school took out an insurance claim, I think on the order of hundreds of thousands of dollars, to insure against potential geopolitical conflict that would lead to a sharp drop in Chinese student population. And so these are all these examples of how a university is becoming more, it's run more like a company. And when they're like this, they're also treated as such by the government. And this is coinciding with a general attitude in the legal realm towards how intellectual property is being conceived and being governed. And with the two main tenets, one is the criminalization of intellectual property infringement. That's starting with the Economic Espionage Act of 1996 that made, for the first time, intellectual property infringement a federal crime. On the other hand, is the transnational intellectual property enforcement with the TRIPS agreement in 1995. And this may have been in the news quite a bit over the past few years because of the COVID pandemic and the distribution of vaccines. So when we talk about intellectual property or proprietary information or the fruits of academic research, I think it is very important to constantly ask this question, is like, who owns knowledge? Because something cannot be stolen unless it is owned first. And even the perception of something that may be owned will have an impact on how academic research is being governed. As last year's Chips and Science Act would have this category about malign foreign talent recruitment program. And one could see that in the clauses, the restrictions towards the transnational flow of information is not exclusive to patentable or intellectual properties, but also includes a much broader realm of information. And also the restrictions are placed on the people who may potentially carry this information in their heads. And so we will get into more of the detailed discussions in the panel. But to conclude, I would like to come to back to history. Right? As we've seen throughout this whirlwind tour across over 150 years, we know that transnational knowledge flows have always been conditional and controlled. And so I don't necessarily think it is that useful to talk about science being borderless when scientists all live in a bordered world, it's like saying I cannot see race in a world with races and racism. It is much more important to ask the question of who sets the conditions and to what end. So the fundamental question here is not necessarily who or where the work is done, but how and what for. It's not necessarily how much or whether the United States and China collaborate in science. That is one question. But the more fundamental question is what kind of scientific work is being done, who it benefits, and at what cost. And the answer to whether or not these two countries collaborate, in what areas and in what ways, and how they are restricted, would be a reflection of what kind of scientific work is being pursued, and would have an impact on what kind of scientific work is being pursued and to what end. And so this is where I come back to this campus. As I mentioned earlier, I feel a personal affinity from my own academic trajectory with this campus. But also, this is known as the incubator for Silicon Valley and everything. On the other hand, the namesake of this campus also made his fortune from, well, predominantly Chinese railway workers. And so how do we perceive scientists or members of the academy? Coming back to Edmund James's letter, back in 1905, under the Chinese Exclusion Act, he was advocating to President Theodore Roosevelt that we may not admit Chinese laborer, but we can treat the Chinese students decently. However, should there be such a distinction between the laborer and the knowledge worker? I think it is important when we think about our roles as scientists and as academic workers to know that a university is not just a congregation of minds. It's also a congregation of bodies. We do not leave our bodies behind when we enter a classroom or a laboratory or the archive. A university is also a major employer, landlord, and policing agent in their cities. And when we talk about the effects of racial profiling or Asian racialization in general that faces Chinese American scientists in this country, we also need to understand the history of Asian racialization in the US that cannot be separated from the development of capitalism, of policing, and of decades of US military aggression in the Asian continent. And a lot of that has been justified and facilitated by new technology. So I think it is important when we think about the current challenges and the futures of US-China scientific collaboration and exchange to place that into a larger and longer history, to have a more capacious understanding. And that is where I would like to conclude with this line from the Chinese-American activist Grace Lee Boggs with her husband James Boggs when she said, "One of the first steps towards creating an enlarged concept of our humanity is to develop an enlarged concept of our relation as human beings to politics." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yangyang. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tom Fingar.
Yangyang, why don't you sit down here and I'll invite Norbert and Steve to come up. I assume that's why the chairs are here. Those of you who are here for Peter's introduction of me may wonder why a political scientist is here chairing a panel in a physics colloquium. Where's my watch going crazy?
Maybe you're being surveilled.
It thinks I fell down. Yangyang's presentation underscored for me a lot of relevant history. That beginning with the mention of Anson-Burlingame and the early treaty, that's the same Anson-Burlingame for whom the city of Burlingame, by the airport, is named. That the role of science and technology in both the building and the rebuilding of the relationship between the United States and China was central. I say that out of experience, that beginning in the Ford administration and then particularly so in the Carter administration, I was the trial balloon guy for normalization, particularly education and science and technology cooperation. Yangyang referred to the science and technology cooperative agreement as the first. Actually, it's the second. The first one was an educational exchange. And the first education exchange agreement was between Stanford and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. It was the model for the later government-to-government agreement, which was signed in December of 1979, a month or so ahead of the S&T agreement. And the first specific agreement under the umbrella one was in high energy physics, signed at SLAC. And Panofsky pressed me into service, translating for the Deputy Secretary of Energy at the time. So there's a long involvement of scientists from China, scientists from the United States, teaching and working in China. The symbolic importance in clearing the way for the reestablishment of diplomatic relations in 1979 of science and education. And to oversimplify greatly, as China was signaling Deng Xiaoping's intention to switch policy by 180 degrees, to open up China to outside influences, and to transform the system. That was a decision that could not have been implemented without U.S. cooperation. The U.S. was saying, how do we know you're really going to do this? If you really do it, we'll support it, because, again, as Yangyang indicated, it opened the way for the United States to achieve security objectives, economic objectives, and people-to-people objectives. In the signaling back and forth that, will you take in American students, how many American students, how many Chinese students will you take, and what the precise details with. Once a delegation headed by Frank Press, the President's science advisor at the time, went to China in July of 1978. It was the highest ranking U.S. science government officials that we ever sent any place. And that symbolic, we will support you, cleared the way for the reform and opening policy, which cleared the way for recognition of the United States. Diplomatic recognition was announced at the same time as the reform and opening policy. And we implemented the science agreement pretty quickly. That there was an eagerness on both sides to move forward. I remember doing some interviewing in China in the early 1980s, and there was a lot of unhappiness about the speed with which it was implemented, not because scientists didn't like it, but because the fields in which China had agreed to cooperate with the United States were the favored fields. They got funded. And the fields that didn't have an agreement with the United States, lacked for money, lacked for graduate students, were kind of a second class. So it took a while to sort that out. I shouldn't be talking about history except one more. I'm up here, I think, because I'm on the National Academy's panel roundtable for science, technology, and national security. The issues that Yangyang referred to here. Is science an undertaking that is inherently multinational, international, without borders, that must be open, transparent, cooperative, collaborative, or can or must certain areas be fenced off, be protected, be limited in terms of accessibility to people from particular backgrounds or places? that the United States, as a part of Cold War policies, so dating from the 1950s, has advocated openness and non-classified scientific research. There's been a lot of pressure in the last 3 years, 4 years, to backtrack from that, to limit accessibility. So for the remainder of the program here, we'd like to focus on the importance of open science, called big science, but it's not just big science. Openness of science, not just within universities, but across borders. What's the benefit to us? What's the benefit to others? What's the record show in terms of progress, human progress in health, economics, and elsewhere? But also the other side. Are there legitimate reasons or necessary considerations for restricting access? And restricting access is something that China does, I would argue, more than the United States does. We're sliding in the direction of doing something that really hasn't worked very well for China historically. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to pass the microphone first to Steven Chu and then to Norbert Holtkamp. I think they need little introduction, and they'll get little introduction. I'm well known for giving nobody the introduction they deserve. But Steve Chu, to my right, winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics, former Secretary of Energy, professor here at Stanford, and Norbert Holtkamp, until very recently the Deputy Director of the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, physicist, high energy physicist, and now a fellow, science fellow at the Hoover Institution. So I'm going to ask each of them to comment as they think appropriate to points raised by Yangyang, and then we'll come back to Yangyang, and then we'll open up to the floor. Steve?
Well, Yangyang made so many points, it's hard. but let me just start by saying how I personally feel about science and its restriction. And that is, I have this idealistic version that view that at fundamental science, basic science, this is pre-ID science, this is what is normally gets published in the open literature. I think it goes forward a lot better if it remains free and open. What has been happening recently, including some voices on campus here, would be that we have to relook at these technologically important areas. And to Yangyang's point, it's viewed that, we in America, some people think we're so far ahead in science, but if you take these ideas and you turn it into industrial advantage, China does this very well. We forgot that in the 1800s, the United States was not a scientific leader, it was Europe, and we took the ideas from Europe and turned them into technological advantage. and so all of a sudden, and there was nothing that seemed bad to Americans of doing this. I'm not sure how the Europeans felt, but now there's this feeling that among some people who I regard as not knowing that much about science, thinking that the United States is so far ahead in science and therefore we should restrict it so that China is not able to turn this into economic technological advantage. I think this view is, I don't share this view, and in many areas in science, we are not the leader anymore. And it's a shared leadership, or in some fields of material science, for example, in certain areas, I think China's ahead. But closing the borders and doing this, it would be a tragic mistake. In fact, it's been debated, and I'll jump into 2 minutes, that these areas are, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, batteries, basic quantum computing, even basic biology areas are viewed as so technologically important that perhaps people should begin to restrict what will be published in the open literature. So as a reassessment and saying, forget about what Ronald Reagan said and 2 other presidents affirmed, we need to restrict publication. I personally think that if we started doing this, many, I don't know how you hire people, promote people, do anything. And I could easily see many scientists in the United States saying, maybe another country is better for us. So it's going in a very, very bad direction, and I'll stop back into many things. One final comment, I do say that Yang made a point about ideas, how can they be stolen if they weren't owned? I kind of disagree in the sense that many of us have ideas and we share them with our friends, and yet we do not want those ideas before we're ready to publish to be broadcast. And so in that sense, I think there's a possession of ideas, but in the end, we all want, not we all, but I would want those ideas that I and my colleagues have and my collaborators have be disseminated as widely as possible. But before that, before you do something, it's no. And it's a different pattern. So yes, just one disagreement.
Okay, very good. So I'm very happy. Thank you for coming and giving the talk. It's a very interesting topic, obviously. Let me tell you a little bit about what I did before. I call it a practitioner of international collaboration. So I did big science projects. The spallation neutron source in Oak Ridge, the free electron laser, the new one here at SLAC. I was the director of ITER. And all of these projects had major involvements from international collaborations. Countries in Europe, even the LCLS 2 just finished. We had collaborations with China and we bought things in China, which is still possible. So when I stepped down, I ended up at Hoover. That's a story by itself, but why did I do that? I wanted to understand, with an interest in international collaborations, why people think the way they think, and why is it so hard for scientists to make a case that seems so obvious for us. I actually asked the question to Yangyang, right? Why do we not, how do we communicate this? Why do we not clearly be able to convince people in the government or people that make policies that this is an obvious thing to do? Like you say, international science is a competitive world, and the fastest way to make progress is to collaborate, obviously. That seems to be clear to hopefully everybody, or I think everybody in the panel. It's not clear to many people that are outside of actually doing science in the way we do science, physical sciences. It's one of the first things I learned at Hoover is that it's by no means clear to people that this is something that obviously will drive science faster than anything else. And cutting it off will limit it and slow it down. That's a message that has not come across. Maybe my personal experience, but I've heard it from a lot of people. The other thing is, and I think you alluded to this, Steve, is it takes two to tango, right? And if you wanted to have a dance, people have to dance by the same rules. There were rules, written down or not, on how do we do collaboration. It was a two-way street. It was open into both directions, even with Russia during the Cold War. That's not the case anymore today. I always say, jokingly, there's two ways to win the game. Either the better player, or you change the rules, right? So Now we're in a situation that's not so clear. Clearly, it's a very strong player. China is very good at many, many things right now, better than the United States, better than Europe for sure. But they want to change the rules. And not reacting to it is a proposition from the science community that will not fly. At least from what I understand so far, it will simply not fly. So not reacting and insisting that we do the business the same way is not going to work. I don't know what the answer to this is, because usually the US is not very good at kind of being somewhere in the middle, but the pendulum really went from totally open and please collaborate, and hey, let's go do this together, to kind of swinging to the other extreme right now, which is closing it down. These are very simple propositions on both ends. It's easy to be open and it's easy to be closed. Everything in the middle is very hard, because it takes a lot of time and assessment and looking at things, and how can I judge whether Steve wants to make a collaboration and it endangers something or it doesn't? I'm not the expert, he is the expert. But look at what happens. Look at the NSF web pages on what you have to do as a PI and to comply with, when today you write a proposal and all the things you have to sign off on saying that you're going to do, that you hardly know what they mean. Now, the organization, university, whatever, when the PI gets a Nobel Prize, it's the university, right? But if the PI makes a mistake, and it doesn't comply with certain things come out of the public and they shouldn't, it's the individual's problem. And that's not a solution going forward. So, from my point of view, we can't just sit here and behave like things were like the way they were. They're not. There's a competitor out there that has clearly said it wants to be superior, it wants to have the strongest military, it wants to be superior economically, and is not playing open in the way we used to play open. So I think it's up for us, from my point of view, as a scientist, to make a proposal on how we're going to deal with this. And that proposal is missing. And that's why I think we see people just making decisions for us, lacking our input in terms of how we could do it better. If we would have a real clear idea on how I could communicate, or we could communicate to the agencies, to the government, to Europe, wherever, right, the funding agency, how we would manage a perceived or real risk, then we will probably be in this situation. So it's timely and very important. I'm now going to make a little advertisement, right? The panel that Tom is on, I worked on this topic for 4 years, not going to write a report. I learned that, and so Tom and Ken Moeller and myself and a couple others have been plotting to bring them to Stanford and to Hoover, and they will be here on January 23 and 24th, and do a day and a half discussion on nothing else, where we can have that conversation.
An open discussion.
Open discussion. So.
Yangyang?
Oh.
Do you need this for your mic?
I think I'm still mic. Well, thanks so much for the illuminating comments. And I'll respond quickly to both of your thoughtful comments. First of all, to Dr. Chu, and actually, on the note of introductions, I had the distinct honor of actually introducing Dr. Chu when he came to speak at University of Chicago 10 years ago when I was still a grad student. And Dr. Chu mercifully does not remember. But on the note of actually, it will tie nicely to Dr. Holtkamp's point about ownership and about knowledge. And I think here, when I was emphasizing like something cannot be stolen unless it is owned first, there are different types of ownership, right? And what is being discussed a lot in this policy realm is with regards to either like military strength or security sense or commercial profits. But there is a type of ownership that Dr. Chu mentioned, which is more about taking academic credit and also taking academic responsibility for that work. And of course, that is very, very important. And what I say here is on the record, right? I need to own it in that sense. And I think what has happened through like most notably and notoriously during the China Initiative investigations, but in a lot of the related cases, is that there are indeed cases where say, confidentiality during peer review was violated, or there were in cases of violations to the integrity of the scientific process. As Dr. Chu mentioned, when something is not ready to be published and it became public, or it was revealed to other parties. But that is something that is an academic violation that should be governed and treated with academic discipline. What has happened is that it's being cast into this geopolitical framework, and it's like the FBI is not the agency to deal with academic misconduct. The joke I make is if students cheat, that's something to be dealt with in a classroom setting. It doesn't mean the students should go to jail. Which comes to Dr. Holtkamp's point about how a lot of the things that may seem rather obvious when we look at some of the high-profile cases that later fell apart, like Dr. Cheng at MIT with regards to just like writing reference letters or things like that. These really, really ordinary academic activities were being seen as somehow colluding with the foreign adversary. And I think on one hand, the scientific community may do need to take some responsibility in terms of better educating the policymakers and the general public. But I would propose here that I think some of that is also there is a myth about how scientific work is being done. That is this great man history of science where there's like individual geniuses who suddenly have a eureka moment, and that is how scientific progress is being made. And so under that narrative, then it becomes more sensible to tightly guard these individual genius ideas without understanding the context that throughout the history of scientific progress, even these individualized eureka moments came from incremental change, incremental progress that was largely done collaboratively. And so I think that is an important point as well. And I think coming to the final point about it takes two to tango, where this is a bilateral relationship where there are the U.S. and China. And of course, like the Chinese government has implemented new laws, including this year through the new the revamped anti-espionage laws and with new restrictions with regards to transnational data flows. So there is a context here that the Chinese government is and may continue to further restrict different types of exchange, commercial exchange as well as academic exchange. And I think the question here, when we are speaking at a U.S. campus and a U.S. policy standpoint, is not necessarily so much about because Beijing is doing this, so the U.S. side should do something similar. Then what's the point? Right? What is more important here is to think about what is this scientific work for. If it is being developed in this tightly guarded sense, that shapes what kind of questions is being asked and what kind of topics are being pursued, whether it is towards some exclusionary end or it is towards some public common good. And I think there is a limitation to how much the US government can influence the Chinese government's behavior, as we've seen throughout history. But what is more important is the response to that will have a profound impact on how scientific work is being done in this country, and not limited, not just that, but in a general sense of academic freedom and civil liberties, when a lot of these questions that it seems to be, it's just extra scrutiny on a handful or a number of Chinese American students and scientists, that may still seem like a small minority, but it has a profound impact in terms of academic freedom, in terms of what are the ability for the academy to self-govern and to be able to seize instead of yielding more ground to the state or to other special interests.
Okay, I want to open this up to questions from the floor. Peter, I don't know if there's a protocol in terms of recognizing. A hand goes up. I saw this hand.
First of all, this was a wonderful panel, and also Yangyang, your introduction, very thought-provoking. I'm very, very solidly in agreement with a lot of what was said, particularly by Steve. But there's one thing that wasn't brought up, and that's why I raised my hand. And that is not about the topics that are discussed or the natures of the large collaborations, but rather the people, and in particular, the graduate students. And when, I want to just bring into this discussion the way this actually happens. The way it happens is a small group of faculty in each department without any outside intervention, look across the world and try to get the very, very best students who are willing to come here to actually come here. And then they do that. And honestly, it is based on the quality of the person, not the fact that they're going to be working on something that's high-tech or low-tech or fundamental or applied. It's the quality of that individual. So it's how they performed in their background in schools and in China and what their teachers think of them. And we bring them here, and they're the secret sauce that makes everything work so well and makes the educational system the sort of wonder of the world and all that stuff. It's those people. And are we going to now say that we need to restrict that? We don't even know. That's not intellectual property yet. That's the people themselves. How do we make sure that that spigot remains open and free? I think that's maybe one of the biggest issues that we have to face.
Yangyang, you want to reply?
Sure, because well, I was one of these students, and this is one of the actually I wrote this in an essay for Wired magazine last year, which opens with this question: is had I been born some 10-15 years later, would I still aspire to come to the U.S. to become a scientist? And I've asked myself this question countless times over the past few years, and I do not have an answer. And I think on one hand I know that the reasons that compelled me to leave my country of birth to come to this country were intensely personal. And as long as those intensely personal conditions remain, I may still be looking for a way to leave. On the other hand, I also understand as an individual, you negotiate with the conditions and the opportunities that were afforded to you. And I think it is, so I really appreciate you bringing up this point. And I'll actually make a plug here that actually tomorrow afternoon at 5 to 6, I'm hosting a little, with the kind help of Judy here, with Chinese students, and at one of the rooms, which room?
PAB 232.
Oh, PAB 232, and so everyone is welcome, and we can even all speak Mandarin, and that's encryption, and then so. but I think it is very, very important that when coming back to Dr. Holtkamp's point about these policy discussions, often it's becoming so abstract. There are no people, no bodies involved, right? It's all just these abstract notions of national competitiveness or national strength. Or individuals only become numbers on a spreadsheet. And I think a lot of my work, coming from my own position, is that it is very important to have it be embodied, that I understand there is a human cost there. But then to add an addendum here is with regards to international students recruitment or the movement of people in general, I think it is also important to not isolate a specific group of people. As I come back to what I mentioned in the talk, throughout the history of Chinese migration to this country, or migration in general to this country, there time and again the U.S. government would use its own needs to use the border as a tool of racial capitalism to stratify labor, to rank bodies, who is more desirable and who is less. And I think it is very, very important when we think about the treatment of international students or international student recruitment, to keep in mind that first of all, migration is a human right, that anyone should be free to move and free to stay. And with that understanding, that also has an impact of what kind of scientific work is being done. Because if scientists are being seen as somehow superior, then that has an impact of the social cost of the work. And I think that is an addendum that I would like to contextualize as well. I'd like to hear more thoughts of.
Well, these are very complex issues, but I think to Phil's point, if you look at American science from the 20th century and especially the latter half of the 20th century, and you think about where it would be without immigrants or the children of immigrants, it would be in a very different place. I mean, my mother and father came to the United States during World War II to go to graduate school at MIT. they were expecting actually to go back because my mother's father came to Cornell, went back. My father's older sister went to Michigan and then went back. And then after the Communist Revolution, they had to all leave or could not go back because it would be killed. In fact, so there was that reality. But going back to this point of, it's not intellectual property, it's talent. But the belief that these are going to be spies in the making is so short-sighted and so weird to me. That it's hard to imagine, but that it is happening, but it is happening. They are beginning to be regarded in some circles in the United States as we can't trust these people because they're here to learn what they can and go back to the home country. And if you put it in the context of how the United States has been specifically from Chinese students, it's like, the danger of 1 in 10,000, 1 in 1,000, I don't even know what the number is, or 1 in a million, or whatever, and what you're going to give up doesn't seem like a good calculation.
Yeah, I agree. There's too much discussion about the risk of this kind of immigration, not enough about opportunity. Luckily, this is a capitalist country, so demographics and economics is something that's totally coupled, and without immigration, this country is not going to work, especially not on science and technology. So it goes back to what you said, right? Waves of immigration coming in here and spurring economic growth. So the rational discussion, I actually go into the right direction. I don't know if you saw today, but today actually came a president's order out that said that you don't have to leave the country anymore, you get your J visa extended. So I was an immigrant, I had to go through all this visa stuff. Many of you were not. I know what that means. You have to do this, and you have to do that, and da-da-da. Actually, it's easy. I also come from a country, which you wouldn't believe, which has a very screwed up immigration policy. So there's something to be proud of. I think it's more about people feeling welcome once they're here. That's a much bigger risk than getting a visa stapled to your degree when you come out of the university or getting into the country. That's what I see. There's a lot of discussion about, how do we make people not feel unwelcome while they stay here and actually have an intention to stay here and the motivation to continue to be here. I think people are motivated because if you have the choice between going back to a war-fighting Russia or kind of not exactly liberal China versus being educated here and live in this country or in Europe, it's probably pretty obvious. So I don't think that's the problem.
Well, I want to agree with the point you made about being welcome. One of the things that is not fully appreciated is the United States is a very special country. You can come in here as an immigrant, and your children will be born here. You'll be seen as an American. You can go to Switzerland or Germany, and you can be 4 or 5 generations, and you will be viewed as a foreigner. And that welcoming attitude of America was our biggest drawing card up until recently, and now it's being threatened. And Chinese graduate students and postdocs, I see, they're beginning to say, no, I don't think I'm going to go to the United States. They want to go to an English-speaking country because science, I'm talking now about science and technology, but because English is the language of science. And so they'll first go to an English-speaking country, but I should also point out that in many universities in Germany in physics and PhD programs, the courses are taught in English. Okay? And in France. And going down the list. And sometimes in the United States, the courses are taught in English.
In France?
Yeah, in France. I'm on a charity review committee called the STC. so going back to this thing, we are at risk of shutting down the best thing we have for recruiting students, which is, come here and you'll be accepted here, even first generation. Okay? Will be accepted here as just you, not being seen as a foreigner, labeled from a different country. And this is at risk, and this is crazy. And we're not shooting ourselves in the foot. We're shooting ourselves somewhere close to the head. Some of the important part of the head.
Artie?
Presumably over the coming months, the protocol for scientific cooperation is being negotiated. Is it relevant to the discussions we're having today of openness? And if it is relevant, why is there so little discussion of it in the scientific community?
If I want to try that, in the scientific community, this is the renewal of the overarching S&P agreement, which was extended for a very limited time because starting it over is in the too hard to do category. Any of you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can try. So I think for many APIs and many researchers, we're not in big science. It really doesn't, they never saw an impact, right? It existed for more than 30 years now, and it was always there, so it had an impact. It has an impact on bigger collaborations or big science interactions, and not having it is a problem, for sure. But I don't think on a daily basis really making an impact. That's why we don't discuss it. They only see the back end when let's say it runs out and for a year or so and contracts run out, and collaboration agreements run out, it goes away. How many people even here know what we're talking about? How many people know what an S&P agreement is and what it actually means? Okay.
Not many.
No, it is, I don't know what it means.
Okay. I think that's the answer. It's not complicated answer. It's something that should be there, but it's something that's not complicated.
Do we have other questions or comments? Let's go right to the middle. Yes, sir. You, right there.
Okay, so, well, I was also really interested in part of this question earlier about how. I know there's discussions happening this week. I'm missing a piece of concreteness to what actually happens. So on one hand, if we're swinging the pendulum to a point where things are being restricted, what concretely does that mean, like practically? Like, are our journals, as Stephen Chu was saying, journals start getting more moderated or vetted or something like that? What other concrete things are people talking about, policymakers talking about? And then I guess this theme of me wanting some concreteness also is about how we make sure that the faucets stay open. But that, I guess I'll stick to my first question as opposed to trying to address both.
I'll invite Yangyang first, if you wish to take a shot at that.
Oh, I feel that this is a question for you or Dr. Chu,
Yeah.
because it's more on policy.
Okay, a couple of concrete things. If you're working in a Department of Energy laboratory, you're being told you can't go to a conference. If you're associated with the Department of Energy laboratory and you're on some advisory group, you're told no, you can't be on that advisory group. In fact, people are being told that it's not the Department of Energy by long shot is getting worse. Actually, surprisingly, the NIH is worse, and the Department of Defense is better than either of those two. And what you say, no, you don't want to collaborate at all with colleagues in China. I have several Chinese, well, I'm Chinese, I guess, but Chinese faculty members who were born in China who told me there's too much pressure. They've cut off all collaborations with colleagues in China because they're under a magnifying glass. And so it is
mean, I see what you're talking about the probability of imposed, no love, right, and work. So that's clear. No travel, no conference, no publishing, no co-authorship, no collaboration, no buying stuff. It's pretty dramatic. Now, the NSF world, as I said, I gave this example of all the things. If you write a proposal today, all things you have to comply with. You have to be a good lawyer, or a good lawyer friend or something to actually understand all that stuff, and be sure that you understand the consequences of not complying with some of these things that you might not even really know. And what happens afterwards is depending on somebody else's judgment and how detrimental it's being seen, and we end up with anything between punishment in university or jail. I mean, it's and it's not even clear from the beginning, right? You take a research area that you say today is not at risk. Quantum computing, it's a good one. Maybe there is a risk, but you just really do research, and suddenly your collaborators have something that's very relevant for whatever things you can talk about, and you're there. And there's more of those things today, and they were listed here, right? Mr. Steve listed them. There's more things today where the zone is very gray and can become gray very, very quickly than it used to be. And that's fact too, and that makes it very, very hard to deal with. And therefore, the protective mechanism without a good plan how to deal with the risk. The natural thing is we shut it down. Right? Water comes out of the pipe, you close it. That's what happens. And that's, no good water management in place, that's what people do.
I see Peter's given me, we're done. I want to put a note of less pessimism into the air before we adjourn. But before the less pessimism, it's the implication of this, which is pay attention to what's going on. I mean, the people that so few knew about the S&T agreement, look, this is one that affects you as individuals, it affects Stanford as an institution, it affects science as an occupation and undertaking. So pay attention to what's going on. The less pessimism is the lag time between ideas, articulated positions, response to those positions, over-response to them, that a lot of the increased fear-mongering about dastardly foreigners, and especially Chinese, illicitly robbing us of our scientific capability kind of language that originated during the Trump administration. I'm not trying to blame the former president for this, but that's when it started. And the federal funders and people who take their cues from NIH and DOE and DOD and NSF and so forth reacted by not wanting to make a mistake. So they're going to be more Catholic than the Pope in tightening down. And a lot of it was really tightening down on individual integrity kind of issues, not collaboration kind of issues. And a lot of that was, frankly, pretty sloppy in it. But having watched from the perspective of my Academy's panel that Cam and I are on, there's been a clear movement within the understanding of the funders as professionals have gotten more in, walking back extreme positions, taking input, taking seriously the input from individual scientists, from universities, understanding that collaboration and attraction of foreign students and partners is not in the nice to do category. It's in the necessary to do for our nation for lots of reasons. The thinking is swinging in the right direction. The worst thing that could be done, in my view, is to simply assume it will continue to go in the right direction. No, you got to pay attention to it. You got to prod it. You got to make your questions known, your concerns known as a part of it, to keep it moving in the right direction. The other observation, as we close, is numbers. Numbers matter in all kinds of ways. That Steve's point about reliance on immigration, 1/3 of the population of our country are first or second generation immigrants. That's extraordinary. There's no place in the world that comes close to that. It's an enormous source of strength. And trying to tweak this in a way that singles out groups of people or nations is crazy, particularly if the country involved is China, which has 17% of the people in the world. You can't exclude 17% of the brains. It would be counterproductive and nuts to do it. The flip side of it is a lot of Chinese come. A lot of Chinese stay. Most of Chinese who come stay. They're engaged. And some percentage engage in untoward behavior. Some percentage of people who come from everywhere do it. But the N is big. So a small percentage of a big number exaggerates the problem. So as you encounter, well, I mean, 3 here, or there's 7 cases across the United States, 2 of them turn out to be valid. 2 out of the number of Chinese here is a much smaller percentage than 1 out of immigrants and scientific collaborators from most countries. So keep it in perspective and argue for and forcefully for openness if that's what you believe is necessary. Peter, thank you for organizing this event. Yangyang, thank you for